Let me just open from here. I'm going to go briefly through this material. Everybody can hear me, right? Yeah. So it's really mostly for you to be thinking about when you have a patient who has a unique cultural aspect of their lives, that you take that into account when determining risk. I had a student, an MSCP student in Hawaii, in the Hawaii program, and she was working in Guam at the time that she got her degree. And she did her practicum there, and she worked in an inpatient setting, and she also did the physical assessment practicum in a primary care setting. And she had a patient, it was very interesting. This woman was the mother, really, and she would always nod her head, and you know, the psychiatrist would say, your daughter has to take this medication. She'd nod her head and smile and look down in deference, and they'd come back and the child was no better. And it turns out that the mother was not giving the child the medication because in Chamorro culture, two things were really relevant to that situation. One is you never disagree with authority, right? So even if you don't agree with the doctor, you're not going to tell the doctor that you don't agree with them. And then the other one was that the Chamorro people believe that if you have a mental illness, that it's, or any illness really, it's because you did something wrong to the environment. And so even if you walked in the woods 10 years ago and threw a cigarette butt on the floor, you have to go back and make amends to nature, or you will manifest the problem as mental illness. And so it took a while for my student to come to understand all of this. And then they worked through it. They got a Chamorro interpreter, and the daughter ended up becoming stable as a result of her medication. So you have to always weigh cultural and psychosocial factors into making your decisions or how your patient is going to perceive risk. So are they involved voluntarily? Is there an imminent impact or effect on the person's health, or is it kind of remote, like they heard something on NPR this morning about, you know, general risk of exposure to the medication that they're taking? What's the outcome? If the outcome could be neuroleptic malignant syndrome or Stevens-Johnson syndrome, that's a lot more catastrophic than, you know, maybe a little constipation. I'm not sure, Janelle. Is anybody else having problems with getting into the Zoom link? Are you using the afternoon Zoom link? No other problems. Okay, Janelle, maybe just where you are. Okay, I'm going to keep going now. So these are just factors to take into account. I don't know what populations you all see where you work, and you know, you just have to keep it and take it into account. I know that there's numerous other cultural groups that have that same thing, would never disagree with the doctor, even if you're not going to listen to them. You don't let them know. I know in Hawaiian culture, there's a lot of issues about deference to the superior, you know, professionally superior person. And that is, in fact, why so many people go on to have emergency visits, because they don't want to respond to the doctor in disagreement or say that they don't understand. And so they will not take the medication, not take the medication right, things like that. So always something to keep in mind. Okay. So absolute risk is just what it sounds like I showed you the picture before with the guy standing there after the tornado had been through his neighborhood. That's absolute risk, right? And that's 100% risk. But we can calculate absolute risk or real risk as the absolute increase in the number or probability of, this is cancer, but it can be any kind of occurrence, right? So if it's Stevens-Johnson syndrome with Lamictal, the absolute risk is real, but it's not a huge risk. You just have to monitor for it, right? So you have to weigh absolute risk with relative risk. And relative risk is going to be the increase or change in the background frequency of cancer. So it's going to be relative to that. And so I don't know if you all remember, but a couple of decades ago at this point, there was an Ashkenazi Jewish population in Long Island, and women were coming down with breast cancer or were being identified as having breast cancer. And you couldn't compare the relative risk of developing breast cancer in that cluster of conditions because it was so high to begin with. So you have to, when you do relative risk, it's always going to be in relation to, you know, the background frequency of whatever it is you're looking at. Okay. Now, this is a study that I pulled out a couple of years ago. It's on the use of psychotropic meds during pregnancy, perception of teratogenic risk among physicians in 2 Latin American countries. Now, if you remember, we talked about, if we're doing a study, how experimenter bias can come into play. This is actually an example of one of the many ways that you can influence the experimenter perception, but it also points to the challenges that we face if the person treating the patient has a bias to begin with, right? Now, so this is on pregnant women, and this was a convenience survey. So what do you think that is? Is that a case control study or a cohort study or a cross-sectional study, longitudinal study? Most likely cross-sectional, right? They were asked questions at the outpatient clinics, and the physicians who agreed to participate were asked to rate their perception of teratogenic risk among different classes of drugs, and included antidepressants, antipsychotics, anticonvulsants, and benzodiazepines. And so they got a huge response rate, 98%. Now I have to tell you, that is remarkable. It's so rare that you're ever going to have a 98% response rate. People are happy if they get 40% response rate. So this is remarkable in and of itself for that accomplishment. And they surveyed all different kinds of physicians, psychiatrists, OBGYN, neurologists, cardiologists, GI guys, girls. So they included all kinds of practitioners. And then among different specialties, a minority of psychiatrists perceived psychotropic drugs to be highly teratogenic, okay? There was no difference in perceived risk of anti-epileptic drugs among specialties, including psychiatrists. So isn't that interesting? Because Lamictal, of course, is thought to be have teratogenic effects and is an anti-epileptic drug. So right there, the bias was towards psychotropics, right? as opposed to medications that they might be prescribing for what they perceive as a neurological condition. And so I just thought that was kind of interesting because it shows you how the perception of the treater can have an impact then on how the patient is going to perceive these drugs as well, right? And so just thought it was something worth taking into account when we talk about risk and cultural and psychosocial aspects of it, that we have to think about their health providers as well. Okay. So we do have situations where there's an impact of risk perception on the willingness to take medications. This comes from an article that came out a few years, well, quite a few years ago now, 2011. Funny how that happens. And so just talks about risk perception and whether patients take their medications or not. So refusal of medication common in acute psychiatry, generating conflicts in the form of threats and actual assaults, leading to the use of chemical and physical restraint and seclusion. Refusal of medication leads to longer admissions and having more medications. Involuntarily medicating refusers leads to shorter refusal episode and shorter admissions. So they were suggesting that we look into, do more research into the idea of using involuntary medication in people who refuse medication to get them stable. So risk characterization, I'm going to skip through this. This is Tornado Alley, but when you're trying to characterize a risk, you have to define where it's going to happen and what it's going to do. What's a hazard? We've talked about hazard already. And this is just identifying some of the labels that identify hazards. Now, you probably are never going to see these, but you could. I mean, there's potentially medications that get, distributed that can have, physical hazard, right? You've got oxidizing agents, you've got flammables. So I don't know that you'll ever see these, but I just wanted to give them to you so that you do have them. And you should be aware that there are labels that apply to medications, chemicals, etc. So how do we identify hazards in occupational settings? There's our biohazard symbol. This is if it's a radiation hazard. I don't know if any of you work in a hospital. I know a couple of you are thinking about doing your practica this spring. So you should be aware of these hazard signs. I was in the process of creating an online training for folks to take if they're going to be working in hospitals doing their rotations or practicum. But I have lots of resources if anybody's interested in seeing those. Some hospitals require it, some don't. Some give it to you, so we don't have to give it to you. But you should be familiar with these kinds of symbols, both these as well as the biohazard ones. Okay, don't touch, basically. It's just some silly stuff about identifying hazards. Let's see. Attention, Tuckerman Ravine Trail from Lunch Rocks to Junction. I don't know. I think this was funny at one time. So, but signage can give you information, basically. All right, Eddie, can you text me, or not text me, but email me? Absolutely. I just love this, how signs can warn you about things. This is something you might see in Hawaii, actually, because the cows will graze up at the top of the mountain or the hill, and if there's a bad earthquake, they'll fall down. And let's see, I think I've got, so these are some Hawaii symbols. Caution, locals only. Yeah, so here's a guy falling off the cliff, shark warning, high surf. But you know what's funny? Let's see if I have it in here. Oh, this is funny. So here's First Sun Caravan Park. For your safety, please observe the following warnings and information symbols: uncontrolled, strong current, high surf, slippery rock, and Heineken. So you got to pay attention to your signage. Anyway, so we talked about these 4 consequences before. This slide adds in, you know, what can go wrong, what are the impacts, how likely is it to happen, and that all feeds into risk. And here's a risk assessment for you. Never park downhill of a tree you were cutting. When in doubt, park twice as far from the tree as the tree is tall. Just because you live within driving distance of a forest does not make you a lumberjack. Always use the neighbor's truck. So there's a risk assessment if ever I saw one. Okay, so dose response assessment, number 4. So the mathematical relationship between the dose of the agent of interest and any health effects that it may cause. And then problems with doing dose response assessments: the range of data may be limited. Range of doses is not relevant to ambient exposure. You know, certainly in toxicology studies, when they establish the lethal dose, LD50s and all that, you use only the minimal number of animals to determine what that's going to be. And so you may tolerate a very high dose of something in an animal, in a rat, let's say, and we're really a lot more like pigs. I mean, at least dermatologically speaking, our skin is much closer to the porcine skin than any other animal. And so anyway, but it's the range of dose that may not reflect ambient exposure. There's also factors such as mutagenicity, carcinogenicity, allergy. These are all things that will affect a dose response assessment. So you can have a heightened sensitivity to something. It's not a true allergy. But this line, let me just say that here. This line, these lines show you what can happen to a dose response assessment if you don't have data points, linearly. So we don't have data points here. We had some data points up here, right? And so the line that gets drawn is this straight line that runs through, right? But we really don't know if the low dose, because it wasn't tested, it could be here, but it could also start much later, right? And then go up quickly. So if data used to generate risk assessments is limited, and the ability to extrapolate from the data is limited, and the ability to develop risk management may also be limited. So if you're going to claim a dose response curve, you really need your lower doses, and you need to know what the highest dose is going to be, because there's a lot of fluctuation. So just imagine you have somebody who has sensitivity to the drug, and here's the dose, right? I'm sorry, it's cut off by this box here, but the dose is increasing here, right? So if this is the true curve of the dose response, then you have to give a much higher dose in order to begin to reach effectiveness, right? So you need to know where that line is going to start. Okay. So what do you consider when doing a risk assessment? Practices, procedures, equipment. Okay, so and I'm going to talk to you about some physiological risk assessments, and we'll learn about the challenges of how to do that. I need to just take a sip of water. My voice is getting dry. Okay, and when we're talking about risk, exposure routes, exposed targets, quality and concentration of the harmful substances, site characteristics, we don't have to worry about future land use. The feasibility of remedial measures. So these are all things that come into play with risk assessments. So if you have a patient who's taking Lamictal and he knows about the risk of Stevens-Johnson syndrome, he can, the first sign of blotches or spots on his body, he can get to the hospital to remediate it. So, so if it's a condition that is treatable, for one thing, or manageable, then your risk is going to be lower, right? So you have to just take into account a number of these factors. So here's some of the reasons why you want to run a risk assessment. Do any of you do occupational work, or do you work with people from different occupations? Okay, good, Carmen. So that's why I'm going to go through this detail then, because it is important when you think that there's a biological risk, or whether the patient is at risk, or let's say a patient comes in, you just started them a month ago on an antipsychotic, and they come in and they've got a rash, right? Well, you want to know if they've been out working in the yard and touched poison ivy, right? So where they're located, is there a cluster of symptoms or other people showing that same symptom because they didn't get the antipsychotic? So you need to know. Depending upon the occupation, you may have additional exposure issues that you have to think about. And then residential exposure, as I talked earlier about the women with breast cancer in Long Island, in New York. You want to see if there's a cluster of risk. So, okay. So I'm going to just go through this example really quickly, I hope. How do you conduct a risk assessment? This is from a CDC slideshow. If you're interested in going and checking it out, I think it's a very well done presentation on risk. And so this facility has a protocol for conducting a risk assessment for TB in their healthcare facility. So you are going to review the community TB profile, review a number of patients that have tuberculosis that were examined in the facility. If there's no patients in the facility or community that have TB, then you have nothing to worry about. But if you do see patients with TB, whether they came into the hospital or are out in the community, you have to analyze that by area and occupational group. There are tests that you can run. You normally get a TB test every year, right? But there are better tests that can be run to confirm that it's TB and not just a matter of chronic exposure. Some people will develop a reaction to the TB test over time just because they've been injected so many times that they develop antibodies to it. And so this is the PPD test is a more accurate test to confirm that it's actually TB. And then the number of TB patients and other risk factors. These are the things that you have to look at if you have TB in your patient population or in the community that your patients come from. So if no cases are found, risk is minimal. If a few cases are found in the facility, but not elsewhere, then risk is low. As the number of cases increase, the risk level increases. So there's just think coronavirus as you're reading all this. And then the need to manage the risk elevates as the level of risk rises, right? So if you are suddenly having an epidemic of people with TB or coronavirus, you have to develop a management plan, a risk management plan, so that you all don't get TB, right, or coronavirus, and you're healthy enough to take care of the people who are coming in with the infection. Okay. Risk communication. This is, I guess it's kind of timely because coronavirus is being compared to bird flu, and we've had several bad flus over the years, bad viruses over the years. So this was from 2005, the United States unprepared for bird flu pandemic, Democrats warn. So this is just from an article that was talking about how we were not prepared for the avian flu pandemic. There was a lot of concern, and it kind of didn't pan out. I mean, we did have to be ready for it, and we had to have a comprehensive plan in place. But very fortunately, not a lot of Americans died from avian flu. So I'm going to talk to you very briefly about regulatory influences. So risk assessment is one of many things that affects regulatory decisions. So research, political aspects. I mean, if you want to laugh about that, watch the news, because health should never be a political factor, but it is, and it influences decisions, regulatory decisions. Social factors. Is it a condition that you don't want anybody to know you have? It's embarrassing. Are you, it runs the gamut actually, because it can be that you were, well, this just happened. So there was Shiva, a Jewish service that we have when somebody dies, and you have them for 7 days. And there were 100 people that attended the Shivas, and then it turned out that somebody there had coronavirus. So there's 100 people who were, talk about social factors. They were in the social setting that influenced their exposure, right? We have economic factors, technical feasibility, and once again, the fact that the CDC, yes, they have tests, but the tests, they haven't been able to examine precision. They haven't been able to look at specificity and sensitivity of the test. So they really don't know how good the tests are yet. And that's why we don't have enough test kits out there to distribute to everybody to see if they've got coronavirus. So technical feasibility of participating in that risk assessment is very important, and the risk assessment itself. These are all factors that are going to influence regulatory decisions. And you're living in an example of it, and that doesn't happen very often. I just have to take some water. Okay, so here's the OTA decision-making paradigm that is used research. You have basic research, and then you have health risk, risk assessment, and then risk management. And these can be animal studies, they can be analyses that look at the chemical properties of what you're taking. If you have a patient who is buying a drug from China, or, that hasn't gone through the rigor of laboratory testing. You may find that there are aspects of it that are toxic. And then we have the health risk, and these are all factors that influence the outcome of that research to impart upon that risk assessment itself. And then you have the management of the risk. So that's it for that slide set. I don't know if anybody has any questions. But for those of you who are going to be doing practica, I think that being familiar with these things is really very valuable, because when you get into your practicum training, really the one that we're doing, the physical assessment one, the more that you're aware of biological risk, the stronger you will be at being able to participate. And there is the whole psychological element of being exposed to something critical like TB or coronavirus. So let's see. I think depression, our depression slide set is next. And let me make sure I have it here. I'm going to unshare for a minute so I can take a look at these sets. I'm not sure if it's in this group or in a different group. Let me just take a quick look. I made a couple of different versions. So just give me a second. Okay. I've got it. So let me get back to the room. Any questions on any of that? I think it's pretty straightforward stuff, but I never know at what level you folks are familiar with it. So. There might be narrations embedded in some of these slides. If that's interesting to you, it's not necessary. Wait. I think I closed the wrong one. Yes, I did. You both say student. Yes, there is. Rebecca, you're absolutely right. I've got a study guide I can give you. Okay. You guys want to take a 10-minute break now and then come back at 10 up the hour? It'll be a little over. I will go ahead and do that, and I'll find the slide. Okay, so basically most students work it up the week between the end of this class and the weekend that 7930 is held. So if you're not doing a practicum, you all need to contact Janelle about graduation, and then she will give you all the material that you need to get your diploma. So Eddie, we can record it, although in the past we have not distributed the whole thing to students because some of these are real patients, and so to protect the patient's identity, we do not do that. However, okay, so Rebecca, I'm not sure how you can graduate without these last two classes, but maybe you started the paperwork. So wait, I want to get back to Eddie for a second. Yeah, that's for the diploma. So Eddie, if you would like to see your presentation, after the course is over, if you reach out to me, I can see if I can cut and paste yours out. And anybody else who wants to see them, okay? So I know 2 people are doing practicum. Is there anybody else who is interested in doing practicum? If you do, message me privately. The presentations are on Saturday and Sunday, Geraldine. Okay, so Maribel, please make sure, and Carmen, anybody who wants to do practicum, Joy, please, yeah, email me, okay? Good, I'm glad you're all interested in doing that. And Geraldine, we can talk about it. So now that I've made my move to Florida, I am not missing large chunks of time, so I'll be able to talk with you at any time. Okay. Yes, Kirsten, I do remember that. Okay. So let's go to our next slide set. I realize that it's the same slide set for students because there's no questions in this particular slide set. So that's why I was confused before. So let's just save this and this. So this is weird. Why isn't it taking up the whole screen? Anyway, I'm going to talk to you about epidemiology, but epidemiology of depression, the studies that have been conducted, and how you can interpret the outcome from those studies for your patients. I'm just looking for the chat because it's not showing up. I don't understand this. Okay, anyway. So these are, we're going to talk about pharmacovigilance. And we're going to talk about techniques to assess safety for psychotropic agents. And so this slide just gives you some terms that we're going to be talking about. Pharmacovigilance, efficacy versus effectiveness, meta-analysis, safety, adverse event reports. So pharmacovigilance, you know, it really came out of the thalidomide crisis from back in the 60s. And as a result of women taking thalidomide for nausea, basically, and giving birth to babies that had a malformation of their limbs, the United States formed this safety monitoring of medical products and medicinal products. And so there was actually a World Health Organization effort underway. And here in the United States, we developed post-market surveillance. But I'll tell you a little bit about the story. So it was the 16th World Health Assembly, and they adopted a resolution that reaffirmed the need for early action to be taking place in looking at adverse drug reactions, and then later it led to the creation of the WHO pilot research project for international drug monitoring. That was in the 60s. And if anybody's interested in the history, please look here. Now, pharmacovigilance, this is what it is. It's the science related to detecting, assessing, understanding, and preventing adverse effects. And so here in the United States, we have our entire review process. I'll be going over that with you at the end of the lectures today, how the United States conducts pharmacovigilance. So drug safety, if you are not already receiving pharma, I highly recommend that you sign up for pharma.org. And it is a organization of pharmaceutical interests, companies, but not just companies, researchers, all kinds of people are part of this drug safety network. And so this article that you can go to the link here talks about how in the United States we respond to if adverse effects have not been identified and they emerge in the patient population, how do we address that? We also talk about counterfeit medications, which of course after the fentanyl crisis here in this country, a lot of that, especially a lot of the deaths came from poorly manufactured drugs and nothing to do with FDA approved drugs. So drug safety is really about ensuring the patient safety and doing a risk-benefit analysis. Okay? So in the United States, we have adverse event reporting. If you have not signed up for MedWatch, I highly recommend that you do. Hold on, I'm sorry, I've got to Okay, so, no, all right. Okay, hopefully that didn't. Okay, I'll address these other chat questions later. So sign up for MedWatch. It covers all drugs and medical devices for that matter. But every now and then there is a drug that you will be prescribing or is in your bailiwick, or you have a patient who's on that drug. And so it's important for you to know if there's any changes in adverse event reporting or in safety information. A lot of what you see here has to do with specific batches, and just be aware that it includes food products also. So a lot of the things that you'll get will be recall because of detected listeria and romaine lettuce, or whatever products there are on the market. And I will tell you that a lot of organic products end up on the MedWatch list, a lot of organic foods. People are confused when they think that organic foods do not use heavy pesticides, fungicides. They use the same exact chemicals that non-organic farmers use, but they use them differently. But it's very easy to get sick from organic foods as well. So just something to be aware of that's out there. And so adverse event reporting, if it reaches the level of a number of reports, then it will show up on the MedWatch. And so you can go to MedWatch to get adverse event reports. Okay, sorry, I thought there was another slide there. And I think it's a great resource. I get it every day. And, you know, whenever there's a report, it's not always every day, but sometimes there's like 3 different things going on. And there was something with a very common hypertensive, antihypertensive drug recently. I'm trying to think of the other one. There was a seizure med that had a recall on it. So, you know, the problem with, and I'll talk to you about this at length later, but the problem with the adverse event reporting is that you will see lots of reports. They can be from your lawyer, they can be from your family member. So it's not a lot of good control of how many adverse event reports there are that aren't reported by other people. So just something to think about. Now, meta-analysis. I believe that you all know what a meta-analysis is, but just to make sure, they use a statistic analysis that integrates the data from different studies. So if there's been a report on, you know, let's just say prostate cancer and bicycle riding, okay? And some of the studies show that there is an increase in, let's say, testicular cancer or prostate cancer, and some studies that don't show it. What a meta-analysis will do is add to its statistical power by weighing the different studies, what kind of criteria were used to evaluate, what kind of study design was used. And so meta-analyses are less influenced by bias factors found in individual studies if the individual studies are from varying sources. So if one lab puts out 10 papers, you really can't control for bias factors by doing a meta-analysis. And it can be helpful with Bradford-Hill criteria. So I'm going to go through some data and agencies so that you're familiar with these different agencies. So this is a study. If you go to effectivehealthcare.ahrq.gov, you'll find all of these different reports out of AHRQ, which is Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. So AHRQ has established a network of evidence-based practice centers that they utilize to produce evidence reports and technology assessments to assist in improving healthcare. And so these EPCs lend their expertise to the AHRQ by conducting comparative effectiveness reviews of medications, devices, and other relevant interventions, whatever. So this particular one looked at 12 second-generation antidepressants, okay? Bupropion, citalopram, etc., in treating patients with MDD, major depressive disorder, dysthymia, and subsyndromal depression. It also evaluated comparative efficacy and efficacy and effectiveness for maintaining remission and for treating symptoms such as anxiety, insomnia, and neurovegetative symptoms. They rate the strength of the evidence on 4 key elements: study design, study quality, consistency, and directness, and to characterize the strength of the body of the evidence. So their grades are high, moderate, or low. And the quality of individual studies is denoted as good, fair, or poor, okay? So for this analysis of 12 second-generation antidepressants, there were 66 possible drug comparisons for these drugs, okay? So this is the way the analysis will look. So if you go to that link, you'll come up with this study, but you'll also come up with any newer studies that have been going on. So this study it's basically a meta-analysis of sorts, and they do all these different comparisons, and then direct evidence from head-to-head trials was considered sufficient to conduct meta-analysis for 4 drug-drug comparisons. Out of all of these comparisons that they did, they came up with 4 meeting the criteria, okay? So, let's see. So this, if you go to this website, you'll see outcome studies that address specific issues like that. Now, this is the European Medicines Agency, so not United States, and they created a pharmacovigilance working party. And look at that. They looked at antidepressants and risk of bone fractures. Sorry. So I got common thread on this. So this was just for their 2010 plenary meeting. They meet every year. So these were the 3 areas that might be relevant to your patients: antidepressants and risk of bone fracture, isotretinoin for oral use, and looking at the risk of erythema multiforme, so a kind of skin rash, and lamotrigine, and looking at risk of fatal liver failure, okay? So their conclusions that they discussed at this meeting were that epidemiology studies show an increased risk of bone fractures in patients taking TCAs or SSRIs. Now, have you ever heard about that? I mean, we don't really see it in the literature, but when I was telling you earlier about the pKa's of the drugs and the pH of bone, this doesn't really surprise me. However, I've not really seen any published literature directly supporting this. So could be a causal relationship, or it could be an association that women who are taking, or I say women, but patients who are taking SSRIs already have some kind of risk factor for weakening bones. Or they could be taking, or they could be hypothyroid, which also is an increase for osteoporosis, which is an increased risk for bone fracture. But, you know, this was the finding from the Pharmacovigilance Working Party back in 2010. They concluded on isotretinoin, I always say that wrong, I'm sorry, that patients should stop taking the medication if they get a skin reaction, something like Stevens-Johnson. And here's lamotrigine. Lamotrigine may cause liver failure, but an increased risk of fatal outcome has not been confirmed. So I give you these resources as a place. You're about to graduate from this MSCP program, and these are all fabulous resources for you, whether you're prescribing or not, but they're really important resources for you to check, because these are organizations that are dedicated to seeing if there are any risks associated with these medications. Now, the National Comorbidity Survey is a huge, I think this started in 1993, and studies are still coming out of it as a result of this huge survey that was done. And this is from the Harvard website, and it is a national survey that includes all kinds of health issues, medications, and things like that. So this is a resource for you to use for looking up any associations with medications that you're going to prescribe. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. I want to talk to you about two very important terms that are used interchangeably, even though they're not really interchangeable. So efficacy and effectiveness. Efficacy is defined as the extent to which an intervention does more good than harm under ideal circumstances compared to one or more alternative interventions. Relative effectiveness is the extent to which an intervention does more good than harm compared to one or more alternatives for achieving the desired results when provided under the usual circumstances of healthcare practice. So efficacy is how well is that drug doing what it's supposed to do? Effectiveness is how's that patient feel when they're taking that drug? Because if the drug is a great drug for depression, but causes welts all over the person's body, they're going to be complaining and not want to take it. So effectiveness takes into account that human component of treatment, okay? Efficacy, you want to lower your blood pressure by 20 points. That's efficacy. You can demonstrate that by taking that antihypertensive pill that you lower your diastolic by 20 points, okay? Whatever you want to set as the goal. So that's the main difference between the two. This is a great article if you like to read. This is an article, there's a couple of them. There's one by Pike that's coming up also. So this was a study that Barreto published, commentary really, about the distinction between efficacy, effectiveness, and evaluating public health interventions. And he talks about when we're looking at medical technologies like medicine, vaccines, you can use your randomized controlled trials as the gold reference standard, okay? But the consensus that people have that that's what you should be using for it does not really take into account the idea that effectiveness exists and that you may not be demonstrating effectiveness by using an RCT, okay? So public health interventions may not be able to be done through an RCT. And so it doesn't mean that the findings aren't valuable. It just means that it's a different kind of standard that we might use in public health settings. So here he gives the example of a vaccine besides efficacy, right? So efficacy would be looking in the Petri dish and seeing if you've blocked growth of a bacteria, okay? That would be your efficacy. But various other factors like cost, logistics, adverse effects, those are the things that are going to play into effectiveness, okay? So let's just go down here. So even though we tend to look for RCT studies and dismiss studies that aren't based on that design, RCTs are not designed really for effectiveness. I think that's the bottom line, but it's a really good paper. I recommend reading it if you can, just a sec.
Judy, it seems like at this point there was one poll.
There's what?
You mentioned that at after page 18 there's going to be one poll.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. Can you text?
You mentioned that after page 18 there's going to be one poll question.
Okay. We'll have to talk at the break. Are you saying we have to do the poll? I'm confused. So write to me in the chat so I'm sure I understand what you're talking about. Okay. So the question of efficacy and effectiveness one question is, how does publication bias affect apparent efficacy? So that's looking at the patient. The patient seems to be better, not so much doing HAM-D or any of the analyses, but well, how does publication bias affect it? So, and does publication bias imply something sinister? So Turner is one of the critics of psychotropic medications in general. He reviewed 74 trials of the 12 antidepressant medications and found that studies with favorable outcomes were 16 times more likely to be published as compared to studies with unfavorable outcomes. So that's a really interesting and important observation, because that means that our publication stream is affected by positive outcomes. Now, when I was a graduate student, it was publish or perish. And if you had negative findings, you shouldn't publish it, right? So in my mind, a lot of this that he's observing is simply because journals aren't interested in publishing. He calls it unfavorable outcomes, but negative, if you don't have an observation that's statistically significant, why publish it? Why spread the word if the drug's not doing anything? However, if the drug has adverse reactions to it, that might be worth knowing, and so that, I think, is Turner's point. So we're going to talk about STAR-D. I think you've all heard about STAR-D, maybe from Doctors Meyer and Pat. Mm-hmm. Okay, good. All right. All right. Well, I'm going to approach it slightly differently than they did. And Aiden, we can do that question at the end of this slide set, okay? Okay.
No problem.
Great. So you all know that there are these different levels of STAR-D, and that when you get to the last level, is it the last one or the one before, that you can use thyroxine as a treatment, basically ruling out anything else. And so each step is if a patient is not responding to the medication, where you can go. You can either go from level 1, you can go straight to level 3, you can go to level 2, then down to 2A, then to 3, and then to 4. And so a lot of people criticize STAR-D as not truly being reflective of the effectiveness of these drugs. So here it is blown up a little bit more. You start out with citalopram, you switch to bupropion. If that's not working, you switch to bupropion, cognitive therapy, sertraline, or venlafaxine, those are your options, or augment with the citalopram with bupropion, buspirone, or CBT. And then if the patient's not responding there, you can switch to bupropion or venlafaxine, switch to mirtazapine or nortriptyline, so we're getting away from serotonin, or augment with lithium or thyroxine, basically, sertraline or venlafaxine. And then if all else has failed, switch to tranylcyprine, mirtazapine combined with venlafaxine. So that was what they did in the STAR-D trial. And what I'm going to talk about is more from a methodologic standpoint, what factors were not addressed in the STAR-D trial, or made people critical of the STAR-D trial as being the basis of prescribing antidepressants. So these are the three factors: enhanced placebo, experimenter bias, or publication bias. And Alan Leventhal is my uncle, and we've had some very interesting discussions. He's an opponent to psychotropic medication across the board. He's retired now, but if he had a patient come in who was on an antidepressant, he would make them get off of it before he would treat them with behavioral therapy. So as you can imagine, this is quite a few years ago now, but we had some very interesting conversations about the literature and whether STAR-D or any clinical trial is ever going to demonstrate a reliable and consistent, robust response to medication. So these are some of the things that he outlined in our discussion. He questions the whole chemical imbalance theory for depression. And this is, of course, one of the things. What the hell was that? Oh, I don't know what happened, but there's no way I could have an earthquake. I think what happened was my house got hit by a yes, I'm okay. I think my house got hit by a golf ball. I live on the back of a golf course now. Oh my God, I thought I was having an earthquake in Florida, and everything that I said before was moot, but I'm pretty sure that's what it was. It probably hit the roof or something. My dog's scared, but yes, welcome to Florida. Wow. Ooh, don't even say that, Joy. I don't even want to think about that. I don't think I am. I think I'm on ground. Yes. So talk about doing a risk assessment, huh? Golf balls. I'm pretty sure that's what it was. It was an isolated noise. Yes. And I'm pretty confident there are no bullets going to be flying around in this neighborhood. There's like security gates, and the security people drive around all the time. Now, I might have somebody try to get their ball back, but that's about it. That's pretty fun. So forgive me for cursing. Anyway, let's get back to my Uncle Alan. So, I don't know if you all know about POPP, P-O-P-P-P. It's an organization that is opposed to psychologist prescribing. I deal with them all the time when we have legislation going forward. And there's usually somebody that pops their head in and complains about the fact that there's no basis for treating depression with medication. So Alan and these folks, these are the folks who publish in this field, they say that after 50 years of research, no single biochemical or neurophysiological hypothesis has been supported. Now, I don't really think that's true, but that's what they claim. And the fact that they think that it has to be one single biochemical or neurophysiological change is where I think they get lost, because we're all made to produce certain neurochemicals. But our genomics is such that we may make receptors differently than other people. We may make enzymes differently than other people. That's the pharmacogenomics. And so you may see trends in a family, right? You are likely, if you have a patient come in, you never met them before, you're going to take history on their family. And if their mothers and fathers or siblings have the same general symptoms that this patient does, you're going to ask, did they ever take a medication to treat it, right? You're going to go to the most likely place for picking a drug for that particular patient. And one of the questions that you will ask is, has anybody else in your family ever taken sertraline or whatever the drug is? So that's how it comes into play. So I don't know that it's really appropriate for them to say that no single hypothesis has emerged. I think, if anything, we have honed in on our monoamines, right? Serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. Acetylcholine, much more for motor conditions. Hold on. Okay, sorry about that. So they say that there's no good support for more complex monoamine explanations for depression, which I don't agree with, but that's what they say. And then when it comes to behavioral approaches to depression, So they believe that the evidence is much stronger for behavioral approaches to depression, learning theory, and substantial behavioral research base. Behavior therapy for depression has half the relapse time compared to antidepressants. Now, I don't think that's true anymore, and that was one study. But, so these are the main criticisms of utilizing psychotropic medication and specifically going after the STAR*D trial and why they think it's meaningless data. Okay, so here's some more comments regarding outcome research on antidepressants. Short-term effects measured at 3 months of antidepressants are placebo effects, and that's Kirsch. And Kirsch has published a lot criticizing the use of medication. So if you're not familiar with Kirsch, I suggest you get familiar. And then long-term effects of antidepressants, minimal. And they're attributing that to the STAR*D trial. Then another criticism, long-term usage of antidepressants is potentially harmful. SSRIs are no better than tricyclics. And of course, this is all older data that these conclusions are based on. And the frequency of diagnosis of depression and prescription of antidepressants. Enormous increases in diagnosis of depression, enormous increases in prescription of antidepressants, and the conclusion that that's a function of marketing, not science. And then finally, publication bias and corruption of doctors and data. Now, he references, oh God, her first name's not coming to me, Marcia Engel. And I don't know if that's how she says it, Marcia or Marcia, but she's been a writer for the New York Times for many years. And so this was one of her key topics that she wrote about, how doctors who receive money from drug companies are corrupt and their publications are going to be influenced by that. So I'm not going to read through all of this, but I think it's useful for you to be familiar with the fact that there are all of these different criticisms of use of psychotropic medication, but we're going to get into the basis for some of these allegations. Okay? So again, enhanced placebo effect, experimenter bias, and publication bias. Remission and discontinuation rates are high in the STAR*D trial. Changes in eligibility over time. So if you look at the publications that came out for the STAR*D trial, they changed eligibility and placebo bias. So these are the main three components. Even though there's not really placebo in STAR*D, these are the main complaints, and then magnification of findings. And I'll show you specifically what that means. Okay. Now this is from Leventhal and Antonuccio. This several years ago, but depression lifetime prevalence rates. So the year that that depression was reported, the prevalence, so that's all cases, right? Not incidents. Presence of all cases in males and in females, and so the asterisk means that they use the same number for both males and females, I think. But their point is that over, a decade or so, we saw a tripling, doubling of tripling, really, of the rate of the prevalence rate for depression. And then in 2005, there was this huge jump, which they consider due to the pharmaceutical companies getting people to diagnose depression more frequently. So one of the criticisms of STAR-D, this is from Pigot, and their observation is that remission and discontinuation rates in the STAR-D trial by treatment is what they're looking at here. But basically what they're saying is that, so if you go from step 1, the remission rate was 25%, and the discontinuation rate was about the same. It was higher number, but not by much. When they get to step 2, now your pool of patients is smaller, right? Because there are some people who dropped out, there are some people who went into remission, and so instead of looking at 3,110 patients, you're now looking at 1,292 patients. And so this number becomes a bigger number, but it's 25%. So you basically, for step 1 and step 2, you have about 25% remission. But they say that there was a 30% discontinuation rate. So that number is beginning to go higher. Now, we don't have any confidence intervals on these data, so we can't say whether it's statistically significant or not. And if I remember correctly, they never did a statistical analysis. But their point is that as the pool of patients gets smaller, as you go to these higher steps, you're only going to a higher step if you haven't had a good effective drug up until now, right? Or treatment. So by step 3, the number in remission is going down, and the number that are discontinuing is going up until we get to step 4, and only 10% of the patients are in remission, and 60% have discontinued. Okay? So they're saying that it's a biased and inappropriate comparison between the steps because of this discontinuation rate each time. Okay? The other criticism that they had is that over time, in different studies, they used a different eligibility for analysis criteria. So if I remember correctly, what they're looking at is these different, hold on a second. So I think that what they're saying here is that they no longer utilize these outcomes, if I'm remembering correctly. I think I am. They changed what they used as the outcomes in the study, and which they attribute to eligibility for analysis. That they used a different cutoff as improvement. Okay. So those are, they're legitimate complaints or legitimate observations. I don't know that it necessarily means that antidepressants are not effective, but I think what it means is that you can use statistics like that guy with the lamppost and lean on them in such a way to analyze the life out of a result, you know? So while you can parse out the data to magnify an outcome, which I think is what Pigot is doing here, he's then going to claim that the people with the STAR-D trial magnified small differences. And, you know, it's legitimate, but I don't know at the end of the day whether it means we didn't get anything out of the STAR-D. All right. So this is a very interesting paper by Moeller. Is the efficacy of antidepressants clinically relevant? Now that's the question of the difference between efficacy and effectiveness. And so he's talking about Kirsch, he's talking about these different studies that suggested that the efficacy of antidepressants are, you know, can't be used to interpret it as clinically relevant. And that there were a number of studies that looked at these things, but basically, he says Kirsch et al. Has apparently motivated other authors to go in the same direction, questioning the efficacy of antidepressants. And then we have another meta-analysis that came out that used 6 placebo-controlled antidepressant trials, and then, you know, basically pointed out that only the very severely affected patients showed a clinically relevant efficacy. So what they're arguing, the Kirsch and all these folks are arguing that if antidepressants only work in the most severely affected patients, then are they really worth using? Are the risks of taking those medications worth it? And so this author continues on, and he says the most critical paper is the one by Pigot, which we looked at some of it, and summarizing selected meta-analysis results on efficacy, predominantly the meta-analysis by Kirsch, and the effectiveness results of this STAR-D trial, a so-called real-world study. So apparently the authors did not notice that STAR-D patients do not reflect the average real-world patients, but more a selection of semi-chronic, partially drug-refractory patients. And so this author really felt that they were kind of trying to highlight and try to make an interpretation of the STAR-D results in a way that doesn't serve patients, doesn't serve anybody in the community. And so just before we get on to the next topic, you can look at these observations, and they conclude that antidepressants fail to result in sustained positive effects for the majority of people who receive them. And I think my point would be that it worked for those people that worked it. If you want to weed out everything so that you're just looking at the bare bones of the trial, that I don't even know if you can say the majority of people who receive them, because citalopram may not work in everybody. You know, there are some people that if you did a pharmacogenomic analysis, you would probably see very different recommendations for that patient. So I've always felt like the third of the patients in the STAR-D trial, they should go back and do a meta-analysis, a pharmacogenomic analysis on those patients to see how they're doing. So. All right. So we're going to talk about enhanced placebo. Now, obviously, we're not really looking at a placebo in a study like STAR-D, but in most of our randomized controlled studies, we are looking at a placebo. And critics of psychotropic medications observe that many of the effects that you see are really an enhanced placebo effect. That's what their argument is. Okay? And that's why choosing the right choosing the right placebo for your study is very important. So their observations are that since many of the severely depressed patients had prior experience with antidepressants and are more likely to have been prescribed higher doses, they also would have experienced more pronounced and recognizable side effects. This suggests they are a subgroup most likely to be unblinded, potentially making their ratings the most biased. Now I'm going to ask you all, do you see something wrong with that comment? That they're assuming that only patients in a placebo-controlled trial will have the side effects, the adverse reactions. Like we talked about before, a nocebo effect is just as potent as a placebo effect. And so if patients are told that they're going to have these side effects, then they will, whether they're on a placebo or not. Okay? That's how I perceive that situation. I don't know how you all feel about that, but feel free to share your thoughts. But why, if you're going to get a placebo response, wouldn't you get a nocebo response too? Okay. Clinical trials use a washout procedure prior to randomization that eliminates strong responders to the placebo, potentially biasing the difference between the two conditions. Okay? Now they're just proposing that. And do all clinical trials use a washout period? Not necessarily. I mean, they're saying before randomization, but that's not, not necessarily the case. And then perhaps most importantly, because of the informed consent requirements, patients enrolled in drug studies are educated about the potential side effects of the drugs. So patient complaints about these side effects disclosed to the investigator who was on the drug. So that ties back to that question we had earlier today. But again, you are not going to see adverse reactions only in patients receiving drugs. Okay. So just to kind of bring this home, this finding is similar to that of Greenberg et al. Of an exceptionally high correlation between side effects and improvement in fluoxetine placebo trials, and suggests that when it does occur, the apparent superiority of antidepressants may be due to unblinding among studied patients, given the greater frequency of side effects in active drug groups and patient education. So I would just like to point out to you that if anybody ever tries this argument with you, that you ask them back, you know, do you know if placebo treatment can also have side effects? Because they didn't even take that into account. To me, that's their bias in publication. Now here's Sheldon Preskorn, who I love his observations, and this is the article by Pies, Ron Pies, Antidepressants and the Sound of One Hand Clapping. So Sheldon Preskorn noted that in a typical randomized placebo-controlled trial, subjects in the placebo condition often receive 8 to 12 hours of supportive and education care, more than many depressed patients in the real world receive from their doctors. We simply don't know how the supportive component may modify the intrinsic property of a placebo tablet. But my guess is there's considerable synergism. So this is one point of view about enhanced placebo that we've heard from. I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but this is Kirsch's attack on the severity of depression. So he's saying that because of the change in the scale, that any outcome, well, they're looking at trials, they're not talking about STAR-D right now, but they're looking at 35 trials that have been done on 4 new generation antidepressants. And so they're saying that any difference that was observed was due to a decreased placebo response in the more severely depressed patients, not an increased response to antidepressants. I will tell you that nobody has ever done a study to show that more severely depressed patients have less of a placebo response. So this is a claim that's being made. All right. Now this reviews the degree of improvement, and they do a butchering of the FDA data set, and they come up with the thought that that they had statistically significant findings because of this large number, but they found that the weighted mean difference between groups on HAM-D or HRSD was only 1.8 points, and 57% of the trials found no significant drug placebo differences. So, you know, it's studying placebo is a real challenge, and that's why you always have to know when you're, and we're going to go over this in our last slide set, you have to know what kind of placebos were involved. But this is, the critics of the field of psychopharmacology maintain that, that the differences that they measure really aren't differences. Experimenter bias towards select responder patients suggests that if you have patients who've been in the study for long term, they may get different attention. Here's where you can calculate the HAM-D if you're so inclined to do it. This is it's a Facebook page. You can calculate HAM-D. And HAM-D scores alone do not tell us whether a depressed patient has moved beyond mere remission to a full and flourishing recovery. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions here. Pharmacovigilance is also known as blank in the United States. Do we have this question in a poll? Aidan?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, I don't see the poll, but that's probably because. There it is, okay. Okay, just a couple more of you. In order to get CE credit, you need to answer all the questions. Please finish it up. All right, well, if you haven't answered it, you don't get credit. But here's the results. And, oops. Well, I don't have the answers showing on this version. So the correct answer is C, post-market surveillance. So phase 2 clinical trials really aren't as much part of the pharmacovigilance as the follow-up after the product has hit the market. They do post-market surveillance. Oh, I didn't show you the results. There's the results. Okay. Second question. Which of the following is not one of the major criticisms of the STAR*D trial or clinical trials in general? Enhanced placebo effect, experimenter bias, publication bias, decreased placebo effect. Is not. So make sure you answer is not. We need a few more responses. It was the post-market surveillance study. Okay. And then we got everybody who we will have, and so we have majority of you did get it right. Decreased placebo effect is not one of the major criticisms. And you know, I'll tell you on the PEP exam, they do things like that. Most likely, major or minor. So you do have to pay attention to the words that are used. But we went over enhanced placebo effect, experimental bias, publication. Okay. Sorry, this thing is too big. So I think there's one more. Oh. Oh, I must have pulled up the wrong set because I think this is just a duplicate. This is what you were talking about earlier, Hayden, right? Oh wait, but no, it's not a duplicate. Just some of the slides are. So this is a summary of some of the things that we discussed earlier. But this is my favorite quote from the Pies paper. Indeed, this loosely knit community of naysayers sees psychiatry and psychiatrists in nearly satanic terms. For them, however, the devil is a chimera-like creature with the head of a fraudulent researcher, the body of a drug sales rep, and the tail of a psychiatrist. And I just love that quote so much because I don't know if any of you are involved in legislation to get RXP passed, but you will undoubtedly encounter somebody who is just opposed to prescribing psychologists. This is such a great quote to use for them. Okay, that's the end. Now, Aiden, there was one more question. Is that correct? I think that's what you were saying before.
Yes, it was a meta-analysis study.
So can you show it now? Okay, so this is just another question based on what we already discussed. And which of the following is not true about meta-analysis? It can add statistical power, is less influenced by bias factors found in individual studies if the individual studies are from varying sources, requires heterogeneity of study designs in order to be free of bias factors. Okay, that's probably everybody. The majority of you got it correct that it's the last one that is not true about meta-analysis. You don't have to have heterogeneity of study design. But this one was taken verbatim out of the slide. Okay, so that's all the questions, right? Aiden, for this?
Yes, there were actually a few more at the end of the slides. There were two more at the pages that you don't have on this slide. You want me to run those two?
Well, we only have 1 hour left, right? Is that correct? All right, I'd rather not do those now. We can send them to the students to have. The correct answer was C, Rebecca. Heterogeneity is not a required factor, okay? So I would like, I'd rather get to our next slide set, and then I think that's a better use of our time at this point, okay? So we can take a 10-minute break and come back around 6:13 on the East Coast, okay? Great. So we'll do the Parkinson's slides. I doubt that we're going to have time to get to the other set. I will go over the exam. The exam's written already, so I'll go over it and make sure that there aren't any questions that you would have to have been led through the slides, but I suggest you familiarize yourself with them. I got them originally from Bob McGrath, who used to teach this course before I came on board. And some of them are good observations, so I encourage you to go through them. So we're going to talk about neurodegenerative disorders. Can everybody see my screen? I've lost, I don't know why this happens. That's not it. Okay. Was there an attendance poll, Aiden, that went around?
Yes, I can run it right now.
Okay, so you're running it right now. Okay. That's the virtual here. Right. So while we're doing that poll, I started talking about this before. I would really like to offer you all a single day where we do kinetics, we do pharmacology. I know that some of you felt like you were expecting more pharmacotherapy and drug information. So at this point, I'm going to offer it after the program ends, after your last course is over. So it'll just be up to you if you want to join me for a Sunday afternoon. And we'll go over the nitty-gritty of understanding how drugs work, specific drug classes, drug-drug interactions, and those sorts of things. So if you are interested in that, please make sure that you let me know, okay? Yeah, no charge for it. And, you know, it's really what I love to do. How else do I want to spend my Sundays? Well, doing PEP training, of course. So, but seriously, yeah, and if anybody is interested in jumping into a PEP group, I'm probably going to start one at the end of May. And so if you're interested in that, yeah, I mean, well, there is a charge for the PEP group. I'll just be clear. I get what I consider a minimal amount of money. Because we meet for months. We meet every Sunday pretty much for 3 to 5 months, depending upon your comfort with the material. Yeah, I'll email that out, Joy. That's a good idea. So, all right. So the poll's over, right? Is everybody here that's here? It looks that way. So I'm going to end that poll, and now I'm going to get into my slides. All right. Oh, so this is all this. And I really wanted to do this because a couple of years ago, somebody said that they didn't feel like they had sufficient information about neurodegenerative disorders. So I'm going to go through this real quickly, but to characterize the types of neurodegenerative disorders, we have those that affect the cerebral cortex, such as Alzheimer's. We have those that affect the basal ganglion brainstem, such as Parkinson, as well as Parkinson-like. And then motor neurons, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. That should go right off my tongue. And Parkinson's, I'm going to focus on Parkinson's because much of the testing information I'm going to glean from Parkinson's literature. So, and that's really what this hour is about. It's about the methods and testing that you will see in the literature on these different disease states and how do you use that information. So here's your normal patient, here's your patient pre-Parkinson, and then your patient post-Parkinson. And there are some changes here. You can see quite a few changes actually. But this is what you need to know about. It's the person who is trying to walk. He's having a lot of difficulty picking up his feet. He shuffles his gait with short steps.
Sorry, Judy, have you uploaded any slide yet?
What do you mean, you can't see these slides?
No, you haven't shared them.
All right, sorry, I must have not done a share, so thank you. Okay. Sorry, I thought you were all looking at my slides. Okay, so now you can see my screen. Thank you for asking.
Yes, it's okay.
Okay, great. All right, I'm gonna fix this thing. Okay, so this is what I was just talking about. And then here's the person, you know, and I just moved to Florida, and there are people like this all over the place, you know. You see reduced arm swinging, forward tilt of the trunk, rigidity and trembling of the head, rigidity and trembling of the extremities, and shuffling gait. And so this is the typical presentation of a Parkinson's patient. The clinical syndrome has 4 cardinal signs: tremor, rigidity, akinesia, so bradykinesia, and postural instability, and so that's known as TRAP. And PD, the most common form of Parkinsonism, right, is the second most prevalent neurodegenerative disease of aging, currently affecting over 4 million people worldwide, and this is a couple of years ago now, and expected to go up to 9 million people by the year 2030. So population-based studies show that 12 to 83% of individuals with clinically manifest Parkinson's disease were previously undiagnosed. They had not yet received a clinical diagnosis of Parkinson's at the time of the study, despite presence of motor symptoms. And this really speaks to the fact that clinicians need to do more to help identify patients as having Parkinson's, because they can get treatment faster. The majority of studies that were reviewed use the presence of 2 of 4 cardinal signs as the clinical criterion for the gold standard diagnosis of Parkinsonism. So of course, Parkinsonism is not just Parkinson's disease, it's also Parkinson-like disease. Okay? And then screening questionnaires had high sensitivity when more Parkinson-specific items and physical tasks were included, when administered by a physician and when tested among older, more advanced and previously diagnosed Parkinson's disease. So this really just speaks to the fact that we need to be doing a better job. Now, I'm going to talk to you about a specific aspects of Parkinson's. This is a great article from the Lancet Neurology from 2006. So genetic mutations occur in small proportions of patients. The mean age at diagnosis is 55 to 65. Prevalence is about 0.3% of the general population, 1% of the population greater than 60. Okay? Now, these are from different countries, the prevalence of Parkinson's in relation to the age. Okay? So here's China. Let's see, it's a little hard to tell with all the different colors. This is China. This is Spain, Aragon, Spain. The yellow is Europe, which is pretty broad. This is Taiwan. We have Rotterdam, Central Spain, so different population. France is green. So you can see a couple of things here. You can see that for some populations, the prevalence never gets very high, right? Other populations, and it looks like European populations, do have increased prevalence as the patients get into the older range, okay? But in all of them, around by 65, you are seeing cases, okay? So I thought that was kind of interesting because even within Spain itself, right? Because here's central Spain, here's Aragon, Spain, you can see differences in prevalence of Parkinson's. And US is not on that list. But here is where you will find information about Parkinson's, the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. At least 500,000 people in the United States are believed to suffer from Parkinson's, and about 50,000 new cases are reported annually. So that's your incidence rate, right? Good, we've learned something today. So both prevalence and incidence increase with advancing age. The rates are very low on people under 40 and rise among people in their 70s and 80s. PD is found all over the world. Rates vary from country to country, and we don't know why. Okay. So I'm not going to read through all of this, but to this day, now this is from a couple of years ago, but any of you that went to APA this year, my lifelong colleague and friend, Jeff Cordova, is a leader in Parkinson's research and was part of the original team of doing deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's. Now they're doing gene therapy work, but he gave a talk at APA when we were in Chicago, which is where he's located, and he said levodopa is still the mainstay of drug therapy. Now, I want you to think about the fact that when you give dopa by itself, less than 1% of it gets across the blood-brain barrier. When you give it as carbidopa, you get 4% maybe. So you never get as much drug as you might wish to get, yet levodopa, L-dopa, is still the mainstay of drug therapy. And we are trying all kinds of other things. So deep brain stimulation. I have a friend from Hawaii who used to come onto my Zoom meetings with my Hawaii students. He now has 2 electrodes implanted in his brain. He's had Parkinson's for a couple of decades now, and a brilliant guy, but he talks about some of the negative effects. He has, inappropriate behavior. He shops, like he's addicted to shopping online. He has sexual addiction now, and what happens when you successfully treat Parkinson's, you do get this overspill of L-dopa or anything into those parts of the brain where it's not necessarily coming from the nigrostriatal pathway, right? It's from the mesolimbic pathway and going to the cortex. And so when you have a patient who's being treated well for the motor symptoms, you also get the cortical behavioral manifestations as well. And that's why, as we get better and better at treating Parkinson's, we also get more and more patients with active psychosis, patients that have these addictive behaviors that they cannot control, and you get a lot of behavioral changes. So it's just something to think about, that risk-benefit again, right? Now, my friend had 1 electrode put in and then waited, I think, 5 years and had the second one put in. And he would never trade that for anything else. And he's okay that he spends too much money shopping and, watching porn and things like that. And his wife is okay because he can walk around with her and, be connected with her still. And so it's something that we all need to think about. And then at the bottom of the slide, we talk about the fetal tissue transplant work. My friend Jeff Cordova is doing this as well. There are dyskinesias associated with it, but they're still moving forward with it. Research has identified several genes that can cause the rare inherited form. So most of your Parkinson's is idiopathic, but there is a small percentage that is inherited. And there are ongoing studies looking at them. And then, in case I don't have time to get to this, we have studies that look at the environmental influence. And so pesticides may increase your risk, and higher intake of vitamin D, caffeine, and tobacco may be associated with lower incidence. And that has been observed consistently. Nobody understands why, okay? But vitamin D, caffeine, which you would think would make people more jittery, right? And tobacco are associated with lower incidence. I think there's chat. I can't see the chat questions, so I'll get to them in a minute. All right, so I'm going to skip through this. These are your risk factors. This is your epidemiology of Parkinson's and Parkinson-like. You know, all of these toxin-related conditions are Parkinson-like, right? Taking angel dust, paraquat, rotenone, heavy metals. You know, these are all irreversible antagonists, receptor antagonists. So that's why once you are exposed to them, they permanently change the receptor site. So you're no longer able to have normal dopamine binding, or in some instances, it's also your acetylcholine. But these are some of your professionals' associations. I'm not going to say causation. And then head trauma is another one. Now, this looks at an interaction. This is a great article if you're interested in Parkinson's. I'm just going to run through it real quickly, but you should look it over because it's really of value, because we talk about risk benefit, right? Well, if you have a patient who has one of these genetic polymorphisms, right, you may not want them to work in pesticide or exposure to pesticide. Rural living has been associated with an increased risk. Now, who knows what that's from? Is it from drinking well water? Is it from being exposed to pesticides in the air? Here's well water drinking as well. So we don't know. And beta blocker use, you know, it's kind of interesting that people who might be taking beta blockers for their heart may be increasing their risk for Parkinson's, okay? Here's decreased risk with odds ratio of less than 1, tobacco, coffee, NSAID use, calcium channel blocker, and alcohol consumption. And that just is astounding to me, but this is a summary that really does capture the fact that we don't understand those mechanisms that are causing the striatum to not have appropriate dopamine input, so you have that balance of the scale tilted towards acetylcholine in the striatum, and that's what's responsible for all of that. I wish I had time to go through this. It's a great, it would be a great lecture for us to spend time on. I don't, but you do have the slides. And, you know, if anybody ever wants to talk about this research, please let me know. So here's what this study, Van den Eden, looked at incidence of PD by age, gender, and ethnicity, race and ethnicity. Sorry, my slides are slipping. Where did I go? Oh, okay. So what I want to point out to you here is that as subjects get older, you begin to see that male to female ratio, right? You don't always see it in the younger Parkinson's patients, but by age 70, you're essentially going to see that distinction between males and females. However, this is the study. I blew up some of these numbers. It's the sorry, same study. It's a lot of data here, but what I'm going to highlight is this is the females, this is the males. These are your N's, your total N's for the different age populations. Let's see, so this is the risk ratio between females and males. And well, it's the ratio, not necessarily the risk ratio. And you have a 2.0 difference between males and females in non-Hispanic whites. When you look at Black people, you have a lower, it still could be statistically significant, but it's a lower ratio of male to female. This is Asian population, not a lot of subjects, and that's why I highlighted the N's here, but you have equal males and females in the Asian population that was looked at in this study. Here's Hispanic, few more. I mean, it was really this group that had the most cases, but you have a 1.9 ratio male to female, so almost the same as the non-Hispanic whites. So I share this with you because I don't know what your patient population's like. In Hawaii, this is very relevant because we have Asian, and that's a very broad category in and of itself, but we have so many different kinds of Asians. This speaks to the fact that you need to look at your female patients, right? They usually, people lean towards looking at males having Parkinson's disease, but if these data pan out, you may not see that gender difference, okay? So that's something I want you to think about. I'm not going to read through this. This is some very useful information, I think, about Parkinson's. Here's your idiopathic, which is the majority of your cases. You have different forms of Parkinson's disease. Some recurrent head trauma is very rare. Okay, and this is the Royal College of Physicians. They estimate 100 to 180 people per 100,000 of the population. And so with an annual incidence, 4 to 20 people per 100,000 per year. Okay. So I'm not going to read this, but this is good information for you on PD. What I did want to point out here, hold on, they do talk about the MAOB inhibitors being useful to people with early Parkinson's disease because that allows more of the DOPA to get to the blood-brain barrier. Okay, I'm going backwards, sorry. And then additional recommendations for later PD. They talk about using a modified release form of levodopa and things like that. You can also titrate a dopamine agonist when you're treating late Parkinson's, and then that does require, it may require some surveillance of that patient. Okay. So what I want to show you here is the Parkinson's Foundation website, and they have PD screening instruments and scales. So this is a great resource. If you have a patient who you think has Parkinson's, use this as a resource to test them, okay? What I want to point out to you is this Unified Parkinson's Disease Assessment. It is designed to monitor PD disability and impairment, okay? And so UPDRS is something that you'll see. These are some of our other tools that we use for assessing Parkinson's. We also have cognitive assessment for Parkinson's, okay? So you do want to be aware of these different measures. Here's sleep assessment. Now, I was told that patients with Parkinson's do not tremor, they do not have any signs while they're asleep. But they do have trouble sleeping. So that's where it becomes very important to assess them. Here are some other scales that assess mood and behavior, and then getting patients to keep a diary. Now, this is what I want to talk to you about. Some of the scales that are used in measuring Parkinson's you can use for other things as well. And so you may see in the literature MCID. And what is MCID? It's the minimal clinically important difference. And so when you're giving a drug, whether it's Parkinson's or anything else, you're going to titrate the drug, right? And see what dose it takes where you can see a minimal clinically important difference, where the patient comes in and says, wow, I can hold a spoon, I can hold a fork again. I'm not trembling when I'm trying to eat. That is, it's a clinical observation, but it is a measure that is used in pharmacology literature to be able to distinguish the dose at which a patient can, and a drug that the patient can detect and recognize for themselves, or you as the clinician, that there's been an improvement. So clinically important difference, okay, whoops, sorry about that. Sorry, I know I'm noisy. So you can have a UPDRS for motor, or you can have a UPDRS that includes other of those tests that fall into clinically important differences, okay? In this study, they separated minimal, moderate, and large differences, right? So when the patient walks into the room and can walk right up to you and shake your hand, that would be probably a large difference, right? Being able to hold something in their hand without dropping it may be a minimal CID. And you, as the clinician, identify what you mean by a CID or an MCID, okay? So this study, they were comparing the improvements that they saw on the motor UPDRS in these different categories, okay? So this is some information about using minimally important differences, and the FDA uses it, and they have different external standards: disability, disease state, quality of life. You can use them. Oh, so this study that Schulman used it for this, I think this is the same study I just showed you, but it was looking at the CIDs for this scale specifically. So they used 653 patients. That's a good size of a study. And they did see some significant changes on the UPDRS scale. Now, this is to talk about effect size. You all have heard about effect size. I don't know if you know how to use effect size, but from time to time, this is a study that utilized effect size for different medications to treat Parkinson's disease. So effect size is a point estimate, just like a mean, just like you know, our rate ratio, all of our ratios that we talked about earlier. It's something that is a measure of what you're looking for, and so it can be used to estimate the size of an effect in a sample or a population. So here we have effect size of 1.0 for selegiline. And I'm just going to look at the motor scores for now, just to give you an idea. We have bromocriptine with a effect size of 3. And then as we get to levodopa, we have effect sizes of 8.4. So what this tells you is that it's kind of a scale that they use because each study has its own different technologies and methodologies. Using effect size normalizes that information. But you can see that levodopa, and in many studies, has a much greater effect size than other drugs like selegiline, okay? So again, I'm not gonna read through all this for you, but what I wanna tell you is that in this particular study, it's a great way to demonstrate the relevance of effect size and number needed to treat and number needed to harm. So these patients got rivastigmine. They had a mean improvement of 2.1 points in the score for these other tests, okay? And then it was a placebo-controlled study, so rivastigmine was associated with moderate improvements in dementia associated with Parkinson's disease, but also with higher rates of nausea, vomiting, and tremor. So remember when I was talking to you about weighing the adverse reactions and effectiveness of a drug, right? So this drug, rivastigmine, was helping with the dementia in the Parkinson's patients, but it's also causing higher rates of harm. And so while we use this clinically meaningful improvement as a way to assess broad impressions, we also have the fact that number needed to treat to achieve this effect for Alzheimer's or dementia in these patients was 19. Now, what that means is you have to treat 19 patients to get one patient to show a clinically meaningful improvement, okay? However, the number needed to harm, NNH, to cause nausea is 6. So you would treat 6 patients and see 1 case of nausea. You would treat 7 patients to see 1 case of vomiting, and to cause tremor, 16 patients. So for every 19 patients treated with rivastigmine, when you calculate in all these different numbers, only 1 would really improve, but 4 could be potentially harmed. If you want to do the math, you can go to this article here, the resource for it. And so here we are looking at effectiveness of a drug, and you have to weigh in adverse reactions. Okay, here's a question. I don't know if we have the poll up, so do you have the poll, Aiden? Are you there, Aiden?
Yes, yes, I'm looking it up. I'm looking it up.
Okay, because if not, I will just let everybody answer it. So gender differences in Parkinson's disease occur, oh, there we go, across all ethnic groups. Is that true or false? And let's get those answers in quickly so that I can get through these slides, please. Okay. Can you get your answers in? Because I want to move on. Okay, then anybody else? Because we've got 19 people who responded, and it's been sitting there for a while, so maybe other people have left already. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So you can see almost kind of evenly divided, true or false. And here's the correct answer, because if you think back to that study I showed you with the Asian population, where it's a 1-to-1 ratio, so it's not always gender differences. Okay. All right, now this is an important resource for you. You can close. Oh, I didn't share the results. Anyway, you came out trying to equate. Stop share results. Close it out. This is another great resource for you in terms of looking at data. So you have a patient who comes in and she says to you, I really want to take drug X, okay? And you've never prescribed drug X before. There are many resources on different drugs, and this is one of them, International Drug Safety and Psychiatry Program, ANSP. And they have, this is from Europe, but they have huge numbers of patients in these studies, okay? So just for the Parkinson's patients, they had 84,596. And so levodopa therapy was reported in only 1% of those patients. Among those patients on levodopa therapy, 60% also received antipsychotics. Quetiapine had replaced clozapine as the most frequently co-prescribed neuroleptic in psychiatric patients with levodopa therapy. So this is a kind of really important thing, I think, for you to be aware of, that there are these resources for this kind of information. So before you make a decision to prescribe something, especially if you've never prescribed it before or prescribed it to a patient like this, you want to be aware of it. So here's the Parkinson's study group. This is United States, Canada, Puerto Rico. And, just so you're aware that this is a resource, they've published, I think it's even more now, 143 papers since 1989. Here's your definition for number needed to treat. I know that you see it in the literature from time to time. I know this slide's a little hard to see, but look, it's from a website called the NNT. So it's a website dedicated to number needed to treat. So what it does is it tells you, I think I gave you the numbers before, how many patients do you have to treat before you see an improvement? And you're going to define what that improvement is ahead of time. 1, if you have a number needed to treat of 1, that's like the best that you could get because you treat 1 person, you help that person. 2 is still very good. You treat 2 people and you can help 1 of them, okay? 1 improves. So when we start seeing higher numbers, that's when, now this is number needed to treat. This is not effect size, right? But when you start seeing big number needed to treat, then you know that that drug is not as effective or really efficacious as you were hoping. So this is a study. This is out of the Harvard Nurses Health Study that I mentioned to you earlier, one of the biggest cohort studies in the country, okay? And so they looked at the use of ibuprofen or other NSAIDs and PD risk. And look at that in 136,197 patients or participants. So there were 291 incident PD cases during the 6-year follow-up. So that's the new cases that came in, right? Users of ibuprofen had a significantly lower Parkinson's disease risk than non-users, okay? And they're using relative risk. They adjusted for age, smoking, caffeine, and other covariants. And look at our confidence intervals below 1.0, right? So that's a statistically significant lowering of Parkinson's in patients that took ibuprofen. There was a dose-response relationship between tablets of ibuprofen taken per week and PD risk. Okay, now they don't give those numbers, but they give you a P trend. They probably did some kind of trend analysis. And then PD risk was not significantly related to use of aspirin, other NSAIDs, or acetaminophen. So all of these basically had an effect, okay? So I think that that's a really interesting observation. I don't think we've done anything with that over the years, but here we have, let's see, number needed to treat for ibuprofen's effect. They make some medical assumptions. Okay, so for every 1,000 people, the number expected to develop Parkinson's disease would be about 20. With regular ibuprofen use, that number might drop to 13. This means that 7 out of 1,000 people might benefit from taking an NSAID. That's a number needed to treat of just over 140. And so in other words, if over 140 people took ibuprofen regularly, one less person would develop Parkinson's disease. So even though it's such an interesting relationship, when you do the calculations, you don't necessarily come up with a number that makes sense to give all your patients ibuprofen. You're at risk for ulcers. You're at risk for GI bleeding. So you have to weigh out those factors to determine whether it's worth giving your patient ibuprofen. I'm going to go right up to 7 o'clock. Well, 7 o'clock here. This was a case control study, which is for a rare condition. They looked at PD, smoking, coffee, and alcohol consumption. Results, PD was associated with current smoking. Look at that, odds ratio, less than 1, right? So that means, and look, the odds ratio is also less than 1. Here's alcohol consumption. You have an odds ratio of 4.78. And the confidence intervals do not include 1. And coffee consumption. Now, if you remember what I said about attributable risk, I said if your risk ratio, if your point estimate is greater than 2, you then have attributable risk. So you can attribute that drop in, or that change in risk to coffee consumption. Okay. So if the odds ratio is below 1, that means that you have a reduction in risk. If you have an odds ratio greater than 1, that means that you have an increased risk. Okay? So cigarette smokers who have Parkinson's have a decreased risk. Well, cigarette smokers have a decreased risk of developing Parkinson's. Okay, let's put it that way. I'm not going to go through that information. All right, this is a good question. Would you recommend a medication if the number needed to harm is 3 and number needed to treat is 72? Please get your answers in so we can conclude. I guess there's only 16 people left. Anybody else want to get your answer in now, please? Okay, I'm going to end the polling now. Okay, so majority of you said no. That's a very good thing. If the best number needed to treat is 1, right? and number needed to harm, you want to be big, right? Because that means if the number needed to harm was 72, then you could treat 72 patients and harm only one. So I think you guys get the concept. And this is a good place to stop. Any questions, you can email me, or I can stay on for a few minutes. But I want to thank you all for being a great group. I mean, I really enjoyed getting to know you all. I think I have you one more Sunday, right? So I will see you then. I think so. I lose track in my courses. But go over the exam. I'm not sure which exam. You mean the exam for this? I am going to go over, well, let's see, we do meet again, right? So I think that I'll be able to do that other material. Right, we have one more class together, I think. Is that correct? Somebody? Aiden?
Yes, on 22nd.
Yes, so you won't have an exam before that. We will give you the exam after that weekend. So there will be an assignment this week. Kind of pick your favorite. Yeah, I may have said it wrong also, so no surprise. But I will have an assignment up for you this week. It's kind of read an article and identify some of the things that we've talked about in it. So I'll let you pick whatever drug you're interested in doing. So it'll be, really based on what your interests are in terms of medication and researching a little bit more and finding out, what its adverse reactions are, things like that. So I love working with you guys. You're all so engaged, and I'm really grateful for that opportunity. So I will see you on the 22nd. There will be some assignment for the coming week. Okay? We good? Have a great night, everyone, or day, or whatever it is where you are. Thank you so much.